With the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in the 19th century, the evolutionary framework in which humanity was now placed came to be further developed, particularly by Herbert Spencer, who popularized the idea of social evolution. Even among those who didn't resort to racial explanation, the Victorian notion of the human produced by theories of social and cultural evolution was, as often as not, a way of excluding categories of persons. The specific attraction of evolutionary social theories was that they offered a way of reformulating the essential unity of mankind, while avoiding the current objections to the older theories of a human nature everywhere essentially the same. Mankind was not one because it was everywhere the same, but because the differences represented different stages in the same process. And by agreeing to call the process progress, one could convert the social theory into a moral and political one. What had once been a narrow Christian civilization was now, in its secular form, become the epitome of an all-inclusive humanity. Toward the end of the 19th century, James Lorimer, perhaps the most important theoretician of the newly emerging discipline of international law at the time, argued that since the idea of political organization was European, only European polities could be recognized as states, and that barbaric or savage communities must be seen as collections of individuals in their capacity as human. The idea of human rights was thus used to define an incomplete status. It's not surprising, therefore, that most 19th century international lawyers agreed that while individual non-Europeans could be said to possess human rights, their communities had no such rights. Since sovereignty, it was said, was a European concept intrinsic to its international system of law, and therefore applicable only to the European states within that system, it didn't belong to non-European societies and could not therefore be transferred to the European power that annexed them. 19th century international lawyers who adopted an evolutionary perspective saw their movement as the organ of the juridical conscience of the civilized world, a standpoint in which much more is involved than mere prejudice, because it was precisely this that allowed them to invoke universality as a principle, but treat actual situations in their particularity. The idea of humanity has enabled many kinds of discourse and practice that depend on its particular content, particularities that contributed to the formation of the national and civilizational self. Since the Christian Middle Ages, theological discourses defined particular relations with specific others. Muslims weren't merely excluded, it was necessary that they be addressed as enemies. Jews constituted a more complicated other, at once a source of theological confirmation and a standing theological affront. In other words, the Christian idea of the character of humanity wasn't simply a limited version of what later came to be an all-inclusive secularized category. It articulated a particular political theological culture founded on feelings of fear, anxiety, and hostility towards outsiders, as well as occasional curiosity about their lives. But my point is that particular feelings of hostility or sympathy toward others point to different conceptions of the human.